we're talking about the book Future of an Illusion. A lot of people that under-complexify Sigmund Freud have never even heard of that book. I do want to jump right into it in terms of his atheism. We're talk about the high points of the books, and then I'm going to wrap it up with a general comment on Freud and people's inability to understand him as an actual philosopher. So the first point that Freud makes in his book, really in the first 3 chapters, is this idea that we need to define religion. But in doing this, he defines basically, again, one of his primary theses, which is civilization and its discontents. So what he's doing is trying to outline the relationship between the individual and the social system. In the book, very first section, he talks about how we can define civilization, how we can define the individual's place. And then from that, he segues into religion. And so he sets it up at length how we have to sacrifice a certain part of being an individual to go into a social system, to participate in civilization the way we should. As a philosopher, he doesn't really draw a black and white line here. He doesn't say it's good to be in civilization or bad. It's good to be an individual, real, unique thinker, or it's bad. He knows that it's a complex tension, that all people need to be in society, but all people pay a price for doing it. And so when he segues 4th, 5th chapters away from that into really getting into religion being one of those social functions and how to define it, he does want to set up this idea that religion needs to be clearly understood, which means in a language game sense, it's really hard for people to have conversations about things when they both define the thing differently. So he does want to make these points. One of the specific things that is probably the high point in his idea, and certainly with his idea about defining religion, is on page 22 of this particular edition, and that is that 3 things need to be accomplished by the God concept. And they are defending man against nature, defending man against fate, and offering a compensation for the price that you're paid in a civilization. So in terms of nature, religion helps us understand that and also gives us the ability to conquer nature in that sense, which moves into the second one, which is fate. Things happen for a reason, which is what people still believe today. If you watch L Island, that's all they say. And in particular, Freud says the death concept. And so what he's saying is people are afraid of being mortal, of understanding mortality, protection for that fear. Number 2, the fate idea is really about offering us some kind of explanation and alleviating the fear about things happening outside of our control. And ultimately, the whole system really is about providing man with some control. So it's nature, fate, and a compensation for the price paid. So number 3 is that price being paid for having to give up your individuality and live in a world of laws and rules and morals. And for Freud, having to curtail some of our instincts and things that for him are dominant. Religion in some ways offers you compensations for that in terms of maybe even these first 2 things, protection from nature, an answer to the fate, mortality idea, but also to compensate them in general and offer you a reward of the afterlife. He does go on in this early section to talk about illusion versus delusion versus error, and he says that religion really comes out as an illusion, which means there are things about it that are possible, but to believe them is an illusion, a concept that's defined by illusion. Delusion means you believe something can't happen, something contradictory or something, and he does say it borders on delusion. I've said for years now that really, if you take religion on face value, it's delusion, which means the way it's set up cannot possibly be true. So it defies simple error or just synthetic thinking, which means could go either way, just didn't happen to go that way. So he defines it really clearly. Religion provides to the individual a father figure, a compensation for mortality, and an answer to cosmic justice. This is related a lot to that stuff on page 22. But it means that the father figure is like a babysitter. Mortality means maybe you're not going to pass away, you're going to go up into a better place. And the justice means when things happen that are unjust, there is someone else that's more powerful than you that metes out that justice. God's supposed to be doing to the people that supposedly get away with something. Maybe that happens in the afterlife. because that's one of the atheist critiques is we don't see that being cosmically just in our lifetime, but then religion provides that for Freud in the afterlife. So the next thing he moves on to is this idea that socially, do you want to come up here? That socially what's happening is society itself, with no regard to the individual, needs tools to keep people repressed, which means to make them follow the rules. And religion has become one of those great tools, says Freud. And he emphasizes how well it works for this, and also, again, how it is in natural conflict with individual needs and individual desires. So, what we take from this, moving on to his conclusions, the bulk of what he means about if religion is an illusion, if we follow it as a civilization, where are we going in the future? So the way Freud thinks, early 20th century, is called modernism. It's modernistic in the sense that there is still hope for science saving the day. It's scientific-like thinking, right, Bandit? It is this emphasis on rationality and real evidence. And so Freud thinks, like Nietzsche did before him, that there is going to be at least the opportunity for people to be able to transition to a more enlightened, rational, scientific worldview, and some of this need for the fear compensation to slip away and not be so haphazard. So the conclusion here is that Freud does want to replace the religious paradigm with the scientific paradigm, which I say has happened for 300 years. Freud was in the middle of it, and I personally believe that now what we see is there were problems with both of them. I don't think in the early 20th century that they thought that. They thought this was the solution, like all modernists did. An interesting point before I get to the defense of Freud in general is the idea that Freud, in the very beginning of the book, when he's talking about herd control, the individual's place within a civilization, talks about how when he is worried about these tensions, that he's not talking about what he calls the experiment in what ends up being the USSR. For Freud, mimic this same repression inherent in a religious paradigm. Freud was actually pushed out of Austria and had to go to Paris. So in defense of Freud in general, we do live in a different world. You find less complexity. Freud, when you really look at how he ties it to civilization and its discontents, you do see a richer tapestry of interwoven ideas, which means how people function and psychologically. And it's rooted in psychology, but it's early psychology invented a lot of that. And so you find that complexity coming from that balance between that, but also in regards to truth, the fact that there is a tension and somewhat of a paradox inherent in man's position as an individual and a social animal, and how that can't really be dismissed. It can't be solved. It's something where we integrate in a way that's as healthy as possible, stay social, but also find ways to fix some of the problems, religion being one of those problems. So as a thinker, I think he was underestimated and people saw his ideas too simply, like the idea that young humans experience sexuality in certain ways. I'm not going to make a comment on that particular belief that defines him, but it's clear that they do that. But also his critique of religion is more complex, which it's not as complex as we could make it today because this is 1920s, but I think it's more complex than a lot of current atheists because he takes into account these deeper, real philosophical ideas about psychology and about tension and about paradox and our ability to live as a social animal, which seems to be unavoidable. So that's the long video.